Borders, they're usually pretty normal, right? But in some places, there are sharp divides between two completely different worlds. Step a few meters across, and you can go from wealth to poverty, order to chaos, freedom to restriction, or even light to darkness. Here are 15 shocking borders in the world. Starting with number 15, the United States-Mexico border at San Diego. Okay, only a few borders in the world demonstrate such an intense contrast as the crossing between San Diego, California, and Tijuana, Baja California. The San Isidro port of entry, which connects the two cities, is the busiest land border crossing on the planet, with well over 100,000 people passing through daily in vehicles and on foot. On the San Diego side, visitors see orderly streets, modern freeways, and urban development with a distinctly American style. The infrastructure here reflects significant investment, with well-maintained public services and higher income levels compared to much of Mexico. On the Tijuana side, well, the contrast is pretty stark. The cityscape appears denser, more chaotic, and heavily commercialized. Street vendors, small shops, and advertising crowd the view, creating a vibrant but less structured environment. The economic disparity here is part of what fuels such heavy cross-border traffic, with many residents of Tijuana working in San Diego or shopping there, while the Americans cross for cheaper services, goods, and nightlife. The border itself is pretty physically imposing. It's a tall steel barrier that runs across the hills and extending into the Pacific Ocean. On the U.S. side, high-tech surveillance equipment, border patrol vehicles, and multiple layers of fencing are common. San Diego does rank among the wealthiest large cities in America, with a diversified economy based on defense, biotech, and tourism, and Tijuana, meanwhile, is one of Mexico's fastest-growing cities. Despite the contrasts, this crossing does represent interdependence. The local economies are deeply interlinked, with binational families and industries relying on that constant flow of people. But the shock still remains. Just a few steps or a short drive across the border takes someone from one reality into another. Number 14, the United States-Cuba border at Guantanamo Bay. The border situation at Guantanamo Bay is pretty unusual, where the United States maintains a naval base on Cuban soil. It was established in 1903 under a lease agreement. The base covers about 100 square kilometers, and it's been a point of tension ever since. While I know it's technically not a border crossing in the conventional sense, the perimeter between the U.S. base and the Cuban territory is heavily fortified, and it does represent a contrast in political systems. On the U.S. side, the base functions like a self-contained country. It's got housing, schools, a hospital, recreational facilities for military personnel and their families, and the infrastructure is American in design and operation. On the Cuban side, the landscape's very different. The land immediately surrounding the base is sparsely populated and heavily monitored by Cuban forces. Watchtowers, fences, and minefields mark the boundary, and Cuba has long objected to the U.S. presence, considering the lease invalid and calling for the territory to be returned. Yet the U.S. maintains control, paying annual lease checks that Cuba has mostly refused to cash in protest. The border fence at Guantanamo is not a place where ordinary civilians will just cross freely. Instead, it does represent a political fault line that's endured through the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and shifting U.S.-Cuba relations. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of the U.S. base is the detention facility established in 2002. While separate from the military community, the presence here of it has added some global scrutiny to the site. For Cuba, the prison symbolizes U.S. dominance and intervention. For the U.S., it reflects strategic necessity and ongoing debates over human rights. This Guantanamo Bay border highlights the contrast of not development or wealth, but of ideology. On one side, the American community functions as if it were located in Florida or Virginia. On the other side lies the Cuban territory, governed by a system that has resisted U.S. influence for more than 60 years. Number 13, the South Korea-North Korea border. So, come on, we all knew this one was going to be on the list. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, is often called the most heavily guarded border in the world. At Panmunjom, within the Joint Security Area, the contrast between North Korea and South Korea is striking, even without stepping across the line. On the southern side, the visitors arrive from Seoul on modern highways passing through well-maintained checkpoints, and South Korea's side of the border is organized with visitor facilities, paved roads, and access for guided tours. Cross that concrete line into North Korea, however, and the difference is immediate. The buildings on the northern side appear more austere, less maintained, and sparsely staffed. While North Korea has military personnel stationed there, they operate under strict orders and show little of the openness found in the South. Photographs and reports from Panmunjom consistently highlight the contrast. One side represents prosperous democracy, with one of the highest levels of technological development in the world, while the other is one of the most isolated and tightly controlled societies on the planet. South Korea's GDP per capita is among the highest in Asia, while North Korea remains one of the lowest, with limited access to consumer goods and international trade. And at night, satellite images reveal one of the most famous visual contrasts: South Korea illuminated by dense urban lighting, and North Korea is almost completely dark outside of Pyongyang. This border is not just a political border, it's an ecological one too. Because human activity is restricted here, wildlife has thrived in the buffer zone, with endangered species like the red-crowned crane and Amur leopard occasionally sighted there. But Panmunjom has been the site of historic summits, including meetings between North and South Korean leaders in 2000, 2007, 2018. But for ordinary people, the divide is nearly absolute. Families separated by the Korean War remain unable to cross freely, and exchanges are rare. All of this makes the border one of the clearest examples of how a political line can represent not just different governments, but completely opposite realities of daily life. Number 12. The Spain-Morocco border. Melilla, a Spanish enclave in the North African coast, is one of the most unusual border crossings. Though located on the African continent, it is legally part of Spain and the European Union, and this creates a contrast between the EU territory inside the city and the Moroccan towns that surround it. The border is defined by a high-security triple-fence system equipped with watchtowers and camera. On the Spanish side, the city looks distinctly European: paved streets, modern shops, and EU-standard public services. The economy here is closely tied to Spain's mainland and benefits from subsidies and investment as part of the EU. Spanish is the main language, and the infrastructure reflects European design. Cross into Morocco, however, and the change is clear. The surrounding area, particularly the town of Beni Ansar, shows lower levels of development, with less formalized housing and different architectural styles. Income levels are significantly lower than inside Melilla, and this disparity is a driving factor in the attempts by migrants to cross the fence. And this contrast isn't only economic, it's cultural too. While Melilla has a mix of Spanish, Berber, and Muslim influences, the broader Moroccan side is overwhelmingly Moroccan Arabic. The presence of European flags and institutions in a North African setting demonstrates the sense of separation felt there. For Spain and the EU, this border crossing is a gateway and a flashpoint. Some events have highlighted the border as a literal dividing line between two very different realities: Europe's wealth and political stability on one side, and the struggle of North Africa and sub-Saharan migrants on the other. Still though, the infrastructure here of the border, the fences, the guards, and the surveillance, makes the division impossible to miss. The crossing remains one of the clearest visual and social contrasts in the world: a European city on African soil, walled off to separate two continents, two economies, and two very different worlds. Number 11. The United States-Canada border at Derby Line. While many international borders have a stark difference, the line between Derby Line, Vermont and Stansted, Quebec is strikingly precise because of how integrated the two communities are, yet divided by law. Unlike most public places where national differences are clear, here the border actually runs through streets, houses, and even public buildings. The most famous example is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House, which was deliberately built by straddling the line in 1904. Its reading room lies in the United States, while the main entrance and circulation desk are in Canada. This kind of unusual situation highlights a contrast of not wealth or development, but how nations draw hard boundaries in places where communities have historically lived as one. On one side of the line, speed limit signs are in miles per hour, while on the other, they're in kilometers per hour. Postal services differ, as do phone numbers, currencies, and even healthcare systems. A resident of Stansted, for example, is covered by Canada's public health system, while someone across the street in Derby Line must rely on the United States insurance-based system. Well, since the early 2000s, increased security has meant many local streets have been barricaded, forcing residents to use official checkpoints even if their destination is just a few meters away. What was once a seamlessly blended community is now separated by fences and patrols. A misstep across this line without reporting can result in serious legal consequences, even if it's accidental. But the Haskell Library remains a symbol of cooperation. Visitors can legally enter from either side, though they have to exit through the same door they entered to avoid crossing illegally. It sort of represents the closeness of the two nations, even as the border policies enforce the separation. The contrast here is not in development or wealth, but in the rules that govern nearly identical communities, divided by a line that seems almost arbitrary, yet it has very real consequences. Number 10. The India-Pakistan border at Wagah. So few border crossings in the world are as dramatic as Wagah, located between Amritsar in India and Lahore in Pakistan. It's the only official road crossing between the two nations, and it's famous for the Wagah Atari border ceremony held every year since 1959. On both sides of the crossing, grandstands face each other, filled with crowds of cheering citizens waving national flags. The daily ceremony involves an elaborate display of synchronized military drills by the Indian Border Security Force and the Pakistan Rangers. Soldiers perform high kicks, stomps, and aggressive posturing before lowering their respective flags in perfect coordination. The spectacle ends with a handshake, but the intensity of the performance reflects the rivalry and nationalism on both sides. India is the world's largest democracy, with a rapidly growing economy, while Pakistan faces different economic and political challenges, including a lower GDP per capita and a more fragile governance. The cultural similarities of Punjabis on both sides of the border, language, food, and music, are a big contrast to the deep political divide that keeps them separated. Travel across Wagah is highly restricted. Only those with special visas are allowed, often for family visits, business, or religious pilgrimage. For most citizens, the ceremony is the closest they'll ever get to the other side. The border is also militarized with barbed wire and floodlights and armed guards. Outside of the daily spectacle, though, the area of the crossing illustrates differences in infrastructure and development. On the Indian side, it's a major city with significant tourism linked to the Golden Temple, while Lahore on the Pakistani side is also a cultural hub with deep history. Yet the border cuts directly between them, preventing free exchange of people and ideas. It is a border crossing that shows contrast not just of economics and politics, but of shared heritage and fractured identity, played out in a ritual that's become one of the most unusual spectacles in the world. Number 9. The Norway-Russia border at Storskog. At first glance, the small crossing at Storskog between Kirkenes in Norway and Nikel in Russia looks like a typical northern outpost, but it is the only legal land border crossing between the two countries, and the contrast is immediate. On the Norwegian side, visitors see tidy infrastructure, modern facilities, and clear signage in both Norwegian and English. Cross over into Russia, and the atmosphere changes. The Russian checkpoint is heavier on security presence, with stricter controls and a visible military-style influence. The road quality does shift too. Norway's side has well-maintained asphalt, while Russia's side has historically had rougher, patchier pavement. Even the buildings make the difference clear. Norwegian structures are simple but clean, while on the Russian side, the older Soviet-era architecture still dominates. Norway does have one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world, with a strong welfare system and extensive social services. Russia's northwest border regions, by contrast, struggle with lower incomes and less economic activity. This economic gap becomes tangible in the goods and services available just across the line. Norwegian shops are stocked with imported products and fresh produce, while Russian stores in the border area often focus on basic goods at a lower price. The border is also kind of unusual because of its geography. It's at a high northern latitude with Arctic conditions which shape life on both sides. And despite being neighbors, the two countries have a very different relationship with Europe and NATO, which has another layer to this contrast. Norway is a founding member of NATO, while Russia positions this very border as part of its frontier against the Western Alliance. For years, there was a small-scale cross-border shopping arrangement known as the Pomor visa system, which allowed locals to visit each other's towns without a full visa. That arrangement ended in 2020 though, leaving today's crossing much more formal. Still though, the post remains symbolically important. It's a place where two entirely different political and economic systems meet, separated by just a few meters of pavement and a few fences. Number 8. The Zimbabwe-South Africa border. The Beitbridge crossing, connecting Zimbabwe to South Africa across the Limpopo River, it's one of the busiest and most important in South Africa. It is the main land route for goods and travelers moving between the two countries, and it illustrates contrasts in governance, infrastructure, and economic opportunity. On the South African side, the infrastructure is relatively modern and organized. Roads are well paved and the customs facilities are structured to handle the heavy flow of trucks and passenger vehicles. South Africa, despite its own economic challenges, maintains a stronger public service, a more diversified economy, and higher income levels compared to its northern neighbor. Cross into Zimbabwe, however, and the difficulties become immediately apparent. For years, Zimbabwe has struggled with economic instability, hyperinflation, and shortages of essential goods. The Beitbridge town itself often experiences water supply issues, poor road conditions, and overcrowded facilities at the border post. This contrast extends beyond the infrastructure, though, to the lived experiences of the people there. Many Zimbabweans cross into South Africa seeking work or access to goods unavailable at home, while South Africa has stricter controls to limit undocumented migration. The demand for economic opportunity continues to push thousands across the crossing, legally and illegally. The human side of the contrast is clear. South African shops near the border are better stocked, with a variety of products. On the Zimbabwean side, shortages mean that basic items are way more expensive or harder to find. This fuels the cross-border shopping, with Zimbabweans often purchasing essentials in South Africa and just bringing them home. Beitbridge is a reminder that borders don't just mark geography. They expose disparities in governance, economic health, and infrastructure. This crossing is essential for both countries. But for the people who pass through, it shows the daily reality of living between two very different economic systems. Moving on to number 7, the India-Bangladesh border at the Cooch Behar Enclave. The border between India and Bangladesh is one of the most complicated in the world, and nowhere is the contrast clearer than in the former Cooch Behar Enclave. For decades, this region was a confusing patchwork of territories, more than 160 enclaves of Indian land inside Bangladesh, and Bangladeshi land inside India, some of which were counter-enclaves, and even enclaves within enclaves. Until a historic agreement in 2015. Residents in these tiny pockets lived in extraordinary circumstances, surrounded by a foreign country, yet officially belonging to another. They were Indian citizens on paper, but had no access to Indian government services because they were cut off from the rest of the country. They couldn't easily travel into India without passing through Bangladesh, which required paperwork and permissions they often didn't have. In practice, many of them depended on Bangladesh for daily life, even though they weren't recognized as citizens there. On the Bangladeshi enclaves inside India, the situation was mirrored. People technically owed allegiance to Bangladesh, but lived surrounded by Indian land. Services like electricity, sanitation, and police protection were difficult to secure, and residents live in kind of a legal limbo, not fully belonging to either country in practice. Daily life was marked by uncertainty. Farmers couldn't easily sell their crops because of transporting goods across borders was complicated. Children sometimes grew up without formal education because schools refused to admit them without clear proof of residence or citizenship. The 2015 land boundary agreement between India and Bangladesh changed all this. The two countries agreed to exchange the enclaves, allowing residents to choose their citizenship. About 37,000 people were directly affected. Some opted to relocate, but most chose to stay where they were and adopt the citizenship of the country that now officially controlled their enclave. That resolution ended one of the most bizarre border arrangements in the world, and today, while some remnants of poverty and underdevelopment remain, conditions in the former enclaves have improved. For decades, people in Cooch Behar lived separate from the systems that should have supported them, facing challenges that nearby communities across the line did not. Number 6. The Israel-West Bank border. Now, this is a bit of a sensitive one because few border crossings capture as sharp and controversial a contrast as the Kalandia checkpoint, which separates Jerusalem from the northern West Bank city of Ramallah. For Palestinians, Calandia is one of the most heavily charged checkpoints, a place where everyday life meets the larger realities of conflict and unequal mobility. For Israelis, it's a security barrier intended to prevent attacks and maintain control over access to Jerusalem. On the Israeli side, the infrastructure is highly developed. Roads are modern, signage is clear, and services function with efficiency. Jerusalem, only a short distance away, is a major urban center. The economy on the Israeli side of the crossing is significantly stronger, supported by one of the most technologically advanced economies in the world. Cross into the West Bank, however, and the differences become immediately visible. Ramallah has grown into a political and economic center for Palestinians with its own restaurants and universities, but the infrastructure overall is less developed. Roads are congested and poorly maintained, public services are under strain, and movement is constrained by the presence of multiple checkpoints. Palestinians traveling from Ramallah towards Jerusalem often face long waits, especially during peak commuting hours. Metal turnstiles, concrete barriers, and armed guards control the flow of people, and even those with permits to enter Jerusalem, whether for work, medical treatment, or religious reasons, must submit to security checks that can take hours. For Israelis, however, travel in and out of Jerusalem is generally straightforward, without those kinds of restrictions. The separation barrier of which Calandia is part of further emphasizes this divide. On the Israeli side, it's often described as a security necessity. On the Palestinian side, it's seen as a wall that restricts economic growth and divides families. The physical contrast between the highways and the concrete walls, between bustling Jerusalem and constrained Ramallah, make the differences impossible to ignore. Despite this, though, life around the checkpoint has adapted. Informal markets have sprung up near Calandia, selling food, coffee, and small goods to travelers that are waiting in line. Murals and graffiti cover some of the walls, turning parts of the barrier into a bit of a canvas for political expression. Ramallah itself, despite its constraints, has grown into a center of Palestinian political life, with NGOs, cultural institutions, and businesses. The Calandia checkpoint. It's one of the most politically sensitive borders in the world. It's not simply a crossing point. It's a reminder of the contrast between the two peoples living side by side. On one side is a wealthy modern city with global connections. On the other, a population facing restricted movement and fewer economic opportunities. Number 5. The Haiti-Dominican Republic border. The border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic stretches across the island of Hispaniola. But nowhere are the differences between the two countries more visible than at the crossing between Dajab3n in the Dominican Republic and Ouanaminthe in Haiti. Here, the Maseru River forms the boundary, and the bridge across it is both a lifeline and a reminder of stark contrast. On the Dominican side, Dajab3n, it's a modest but relatively orderly town. Streets are paved, infrastructure is functional. The Dominican Republic, with a stronger economy, better access to investment, and a thriving tourism industry, has made progress in infrastructure and services. Cross into Haiti, and the difference is dramatic. Roads become less maintained, traffic is chaotic, and basic services are less reliable. In Ouanaminthe, poverty is widespread and economic opportunities are scarce, and the border itself has become a focal point for thousands of Haitians who cross daily to buy goods, work, or trade in the Dominican Republic. While Dominican traders often have access to better quality goods and capital, Haitian traders operate with fewer resources. Tensions do sometimes flare with disputes over pricing, space, or treatment. Dominican authorities regulate the movement and sometimes tighten restrictions. Beyond the market, though, the broader contrast is visible in daily life. The Dominican Republic has higher literacy rates, longer life expectancy, and a stronger infrastructure than Haiti. On the Haitian side, decades of political instability, natural disasters, and weak governance have left communities struggling. The two countries share the island, but have had tense relations for centuries, marked by conflict and cultural differences. The Dominican Republic, with its Spanish colonial heritage and stronger ties to Latin America, differs sharply with Haiti's French colonial past and Afro-Caribbean identity. The border at Dajab3n makes this division visible, not just in economic terms, but in language, architecture, and even culture. For those who cross daily, the difference is not abstract. It is a lived reality. A Haitian family might spend hours waiting to cross, where they can buy food or supplies that are unavailable in Ouanaminthe. Dominican authorities monitor passports and permits, but the sheer demand for access means that informal crossings and undocumented movement also happen. Number 4. The Brazil-Venezuela border. The border between Brazil and Venezuela has become one of the most important humanitarian crossings in South America. It shows an amazing contrast between stability and crisis, with the movement of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans seeking refuge in Brazil over the past decade. On the Brazilian side, Pacaraima is a small but organized town in the state of Roraima. Though remote from Brazil's major urban centers, it does benefit from Brazil's federal support. It has become a hub for processing migrants, with facilities set up by Brazilian military, the UN Refugee Agency, and non-governmental organizations to provide food, medical care, and shelter. Cross the border into Venezuela, and the contrast is amazing. Venezuela's ongoing economic and political crisis has left their infrastructure weakened and services unreliable. The border crossing itself has seen dramatic shift. In 2019, Venezuela closed the crossing during a period of political tension, blocking humanitarian aid. Protesters and migrants clashed with security forces, and the closure deepened the hardships of the people there. Brazil, by contrast, kept its side open and mobilized resources to handle the influx of migrants. Since 2015, more than 700,000 Venezuelans have entered Brazil, many through this crossing. The Brazilian government had to launch Operation Welcome, a coordinated effort involving military and federal agencies. This response has been widely regarded as one of the more organized humanitarian efforts in the region. Meanwhile, Santa Elena has seen its economy hollowed out. With the collapse of the Venezuelan currency and the shortage of goods, many people rely on Brazil for trade and depend on supplies smuggled across the border. Geographically, that border is set against the dramatic backdrop of the Gran Sabana, with rolling plateaus and mountains. Yet that beauty is what contrasts with the hardships faced by those who cross it. For many Venezuelans, the line at Pacaraima represents hope, a gateway to safety, stability, and opportunity. For Brazilians, it represents both a humanitarian challenge and a test of solidarity. On one side is a country, Brazil, facing its own challenges, but still functioning as a democracy with public institutions. On the other side is Venezuela, a nation in crisis where basic survival has become a daily struggle. The line between them has become one of the most important humanitarian borders in the world, where the difference of a few meters can mean the difference between scarcity and survival. Number 3. The U.S.-Mexico border at El Paso. Among the many crossings along the 3,100-kilometer U.S.-Mexico border, none of them illustrate contrast more vividly than the one linking El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez in Chihuahua. These two cities sit directly across the Rio Grande, connected by several bridges, and yet life on either side is profoundly different. On the U.S. side, El Paso consistently ranks as one of the safest large cities in the U.S. It's home to more than 670,000 people with modern infrastructure and well-funded schools. The city there benefits from federal and state investment, a strong healthcare network, and close ties to the U.S. military. Median household income in El Paso is substantially higher than in Juarez, and residents have greater access to stable employment. Just across the river, though, in Ciudad Juarez, is a situation that's markedly different. Although Juarez is a major manufacturing hub with over 1 million people and hundreds of factories producing goods for export, the city struggles with challenges that El Paso doesn't face. While security has improved since the most violent years of 2008 to 2012, Juarez still experiences higher homicide rates and organized crime compared to El Paso. Wages are lower there even for workers in factories, and access to health care, clean water, and public service is less consistent. The contrast here is not only economic, it's symbolic too. On one side lies the wealthiest country in the world with all the protections and benefits that status affords. On the other lies a developing city with dynamic growth, but also persistent struggles with inequality and violence. The difference is so stark that aerial photographs at night often show El Paso brightly illuminated, while Juarez appears dimmer, reflecting the disparities in infrastructure. Yet despite the differences, the two cities are deeply interconnected. The combined metropolitan area is sometimes described as a single binational community with families, businesses, and cultural ties that span the river. Still though, the human experience at the border can be jarring. For a traveler, a walk across the bridge means moving within minutes from the relative calm of downtown El Paso to the streets of Juarez, where informal vendors, chaotic traffic, and a very different social atmosphere dominate. Number 2. The South Africa-Lesotho border. The Crossing at the Maseru Bridge, where South Africa meets the mountain kingdom of Lesotho, is another border that shows extreme contrasts. Lesotho is a small, landlocked country completely surrounded by South Africa, yet the differences in their economy and development are immediately apparent. On the South African side, the Free State province has relatively well-maintained highways and agricultural land. South Africa, despite its inequality, is the most industrialized nation in Africa with a diverse economy. The roads leading to the Maseru Bridge reflect that. They're paved highways, larger vehicles, and visible commercial traffic carrying goods. Once you're across the bridge into Lesotho, the contrast is clear. Their infrastructure is less developed with narrower roads, older vehicles, and far fewer large-scale industries. Per capita, income is far lower than in South Africa, and unemployment remains high. The physical border facilities, too, reinforce the differences. On the South African side, customs and immigration offices are better resourced. On the Lesotho side, the facilities are more basic and queues can stretch long during peak travel periods. Daily commuters have to line up at the Maseru Bridge early in the morning and often face long waits to reach jobs in South African towns. The geography, too, adds another layer of contrast. Lesotho is known as the Kingdom in the Sky, with most of its land lying above 1,400 meters. South Africa, in contrast, has more arable land and a larger industrial base. That natural imbalance further widens the economic gap between the two nations. But despite the differences, the relationship is interconnected. Many Basotho depend on South Africa for livelihood, while South Africa benefits from the labor force and the water supplied by the Lesotho highlands. For some crossing at the bridge, the shift is unmistakable. On one side, South Africa, a middle-income country with modern infrastructure. On the other is Lesotho, a much poorer nation where rural life and opportunities dominate. The border shows how two countries can share geography and even deep cultural ties, yet live in dramatically different economic realities. Number 1. The North Korea-China border. The border between North Korea and China goes for more than 1,000 kilometers, follows rivers and mountain ridges, but nowhere is it more striking than at the crossing between the Chinese city of Dandong and the North Korean city of Sinuiju. The two sit directly opposite each other across the Yalu River, connected by bridges, ferries, and cultural and political contrast. Standing on the riverbank in Dandong, one can see high-rise buildings, neon signs, busy traffic, and a city alive with commerce. Just across a narrow river, the skyline is lower, the streets are quieter, and the differences between the two countries could not be clearer. Dandong is a thriving city of over 2 million people, a part of China's northeast industrial belt. Its economy is driven by trade, manufacturing, and tourism, and the streets are lined with hotels, shopping malls, and restaurants. It's a place that's connected to global markets with modern infrastructure and a standard of living that's typical of mid-sized Chinese cities. Sinuiju, by contrast, has around 350,000 people, and it is one of the more important cities in North Korea. It serves as the country's main land gateway to China. Yet despite the location, it remains underdeveloped, its buildings older and less maintained, and its economy constrained by international sanctions. The most visible symbol of this border is the Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge, a steel structure that carries road and rail traffic across the river. Trucks with goods from China rumble across and into North Korea with food and fuel and manufactured products that keeps the fragile economy afloat there. On the return trip, they bring back textiles, seafood, and other exports that are among the few products North Korea can sell abroad. Next to the Friendship Bridge is a second structure known as the Broken Bridge that was bombed by American forces during the Korean War in the 1950s, and it's never been rebuilt. The Chinese side remains standing as a tourist attraction while the span abruptly ends in the middle of the river. It's a reminder of the conflict and a frozen moment in history that shows the division between the two countries. On the ground, the differences continue in every aspect of daily life. Dandong has shops filled with consumer goods, from smartphones to clothing. Cafes serve coffee to tourists, and the city markets are lively with fresh produce and seafood. In Sinuiju, visitors, who are only allowed in tightly controlled tours, see limited selections in stores, ration-based distribution, and far fewer cars on the streets. Yet, despite the differences, the border is not a sealed wall. For North Korea, China is its lifeline. More than 90% of North Korea's foreign trade flows through China, much of it through this city. While international sanctions have restricted what can legally be traded, China continues to provide vital goods. When China tightens controls, shortages in Sinuiju and beyond worsen quickly. When it loosens, markets inside North Korea do revive. The human movement across the border is tightly controlled, but it does exist. Chinese tourists sometimes take day trips there, guided by North Korean handlers, visiting museums, parks, and carefully selected shops. For North Koreans, however, crossing into China legally is rare and requires special permits usually granted to officials, traders, or laborers working in Chinese factories. Yet the border isn't just about division, it's about interdependence. For North Korea, China is its closest ally and primary trading partner. For China, the relationship is more complex, but Beijing sees North Korea as a buffer state that prevents U.S. military forces in South Korea from being directly on its border. At the same time, it's wary of instability. A collapse of order in North Korea could send floods of refugees across the river into cities like Dandong, straining their resources and security. For the people who live in these cities, this border defines their lives in a very different way. A young person in Dandong might grow up with access to smartphones, global pop culture, and opportunities to study abroad. A young person in Sinuiju grows up under a constant state of propaganda, with restricted access to pretty much everything. At night, the symbolism of this border becomes almost overwhelming. Stand on the promenade in Dandong and look across, and you'll see the difference in lighting is so extreme, it feels like looking into another era. On the Chinese side, LED signs flash advertisements for hotels and karaoke bars. On the North Korean side, darkness dominates, with only a handful of lights visible from official buildings. This border is therefore not just a geopolitical boundary. It's an illustration of the world's inequalities, a place where two very different systems meet face to face. The river is narrow, the bridges are short, and the cities are close enough to see into each other's streets. Yet for the people on opposite sides, the reality of life could not be more different. This crossing, more than almost any other in the world, shows how a border can become a mirror, reflecting two completely different visions of society, separated by only a few meters of water, yet divided by history, politics, and power.